King Charles abruptly severed the private phone line, leaving Queen Camilla listening to dead air. Within hours of that unprecedented silence, a devastating royal directive was quietly issued across the palace network. Tom Parker Bowles was permanently barred from the sacred grounds of Sandringham Estate. Aides watched in shock as the king ruthlessly prioritized the crown over his own marriage. But the sudden ban left the entire institution paralyzed by one dangerous question. What catastrophic breach of trust forced the king to cross a line from which their relationship could never return? Before we uncover what really happened behind palace walls, make sure you are subscribed. Stories like this rarely end where they begin, and the next revelation may completely change how you see the future of the monarchy. But that single, devastating phone call only makes sense once we analyze a highly confidential meeting that took place months before the public explosion occurred. The decision itself was unusual, but what made it extraordinary was the timing. When King Charles terminated the phone line on Queen Camilla, he wasn't merely ending a domestic dispute. He was initiating a rapid, bureaucratic execution of a severe constitutional boundary. Within hours, the verbal order was codified into official palace logbooks. Tom Parker Bowles' security clearance for the Sandringham Estate was revoked. To the outside world, Sandringham is a quiet winter retreat, but to palace insiders, it is a sacred royal stronghold. Banning the Queen Consort's son from these specific grounds fundamentally altered the internal balance of power, signaling to the entire household that private relationships had officially become a strategic liability to the sovereign. Aides who witnessed the immediate aftermath reported a chilling change in the palace atmosphere. The real issue wasn't a sudden burst of anger. It was the calculated, icy finality of the king's directive. Senior courtiers who normally exchanged quiet reassurances became instantly cautious, recognizing that a direct line had been drawn in royal stone. What this decision revealed about Charles was a profound psychological pivot. For years, he had been viewed as a compromising peacemaker, a man willing to absorb personal discomfort to maintain domestic harmony. This move shattered that perception entirely, demonstrating that under intense institutional pressure, the king was entirely capable of placing the cold security of the crown above his closest personal alliance. The larger implication for the monarchy was immediate and destabilizing. By isolating his wife's family, Charles created an entirely new dilemma for the institution. Royal protocol dictates that the Queen Consort's family enjoys a certain degree of unwritten social access, an informal warmth that softens the rigid edges of court life. By abruptly freezing out Tom Parker Bowles, the king effectively neutralized Camilla's perceived influence within the palace walls. Proximity to power is the ultimate currency in royal circles, and when that proximity is publicly stripped away, it forces the entire palace machinery to realign its loyalties. Courtiers who had previously accommodated the Queen's children suddenly adjusted their schedules, shifting their focus away from the Queen's inner circle and back toward the strict, bloodline hierarchy of the firm. What nobody realized at the time was how quickly the operational rhythm of Sandringham would adapt to enforce this ban. This wasn't a casual request to skip a weekend dinner. It was a formal administrative purge. Security details at the gates were updated with explicit instructions, guest manifests for the upcoming season were quietly re-edited, and the king's private secretaries took complete control of the communication flow to ensure no back-channel invitations could be extended. The palace understood that the monarchy's modern survival depends entirely on maintaining flawless public perception, and allowing the boundaries around royal spaces to blur was a risk they could no longer afford to take. Every cross name on the guest list carried the crushing weight of centuries of tradition, asserting that the purity of the institution must always outrank the affections of a blended family. The timing was no coincidence. Looking back, palace insiders would later realize that what appeared to be a sudden, localized emotional explosion was actually the final, desperate reaction to a chain of events that had been quietly building behind closed doors for months. The evidence suggested that a major threshold had been crossed, and the king had been backed into a corner where doing nothing posed a far greater threat than wounding the woman beside him. But none of them yet understood what had actually triggered this unprecedented fracture. The timing changed everything. As the echo of the severed phone call faded, a heavy, domestic silence settled over the royal residences, marking the beginning of an unprecedented emotional freeze between the king and queen. What made this important was not the absence of shouting, but the calculated restructuring of their daily interactions. Queen Camilla found herself in a state of sudden, acute political isolation within the very institution she had spent decades trying to secure her place within. The significance became clear when senior aides noticed that communication between the king's private office and the queen's staff had abruptly shifted from casual, verbal updates to rigid, formal written memos. This change in protocol revealed a profound shift in the palace dynamic. The real issue wasn't simply a mother's heartbreak over her son's public exclusion. It was the sudden, terrifying realization of her own vulnerability. For years, Camilla's strength lay in her status as Charles's indispensable emotional anchor. By cutting off her son, Charles demonstrated a willingness to sever her emotional lifelines if they threatened the structural integrity of his reign. This created an entirely new dilemma for the monarchy, as the internal staff began to witness the uncoupling of a partnership that had previously been considered unbreakable. Courtiers who had once managed the couple's joint schedule with seamless ease were suddenly forced to navigate a minefield of icy politeness and strategic avoidance. The larger implication for the crown was a rapid realigning of administrative loyalties. Inside the palace, power is entirely dependent on perceived influence, and when the king publicly neutralized the queen's ability to protect her own bloodline, he sent a shockwave through the court hierarchy. Aides who normally balanced the competing demands of a blended royal family immediately understood that the rules of engagement had changed. The palace machinery operates on strict discipline, and once the sovereign signals that a specific faction is out of favor, the institutional response is cold and swift. Camilla's personal staff were forced into a defensive posture, trying to minimize the visible damage while realizing that their mistress had been effectively outmaneuvered by the king's closest constitutional advisors. What nobody realized at the time was the sheer psychological toll this confrontation was extracting from King Charles himself. The move fundamentally altered his public and private persona. Already battling the immense physical and mental burdens of a highly pressured reign, Charles was now forced to endure the daily, suffocating tension of a fractured marriage lived under the microscope of royal duty. Yet looking back, his hidden motivation became clearer. This act of personal ruthlessness was a desperate survival mechanism. The king understood that the monarchy could not survive even the slightest perception of nepotism or compromised boundaries, and he chose to bleed privately rather than let the crown suffer a single public wound. The problem for the monarchy was that this emotional fallout could not be neatly contained behind locked palace doors. The sudden friction between the sovereign and his consort began to stall the day-to-day operations of the firm, creating an atmosphere of deep unease among the working royals. The evidence suggested that the king and queen were locked in a silent battle of wills, one where duty demanded compliance but human nature resisted the cruelty of the compromise. Palace insiders would later realize that this emotional freeze was the direct result of a breach that occurred behind closed doors. The move fundamentally altered how palace insiders interpreted the safety of the crown's inner sanctum. To understand why the king took such a drastic step, we must look back to a private dinner at Sandringham months before the public explosion occurred. What made this specific event important wasn't a loud confrontation, but rather a quiet, systemic blurring of royal boundaries. Non-working family members, centered around Tom Parker Bowles, had gradually been granted a level of informal access to sensitive areas and high-level discussions that deeply alarmed senior courtiers. The real issue wasn't a breach of state secrets, it was the dangerous perception that private relatives were drifting too close to the levers of informal influence. That accumulation of access carried enormous consequences for the internal hierarchy. In royal protocol, access equals power, and the moment a non-royal relative is allowed to sit in spaces where strategic decisions are whispered, the entire institution becomes vulnerable. The palace understood that the monarchy's modern survival depends entirely on maintaining an absolute distinction between those who sacrifice their lives for public service and those who merely enjoy the warmth of royal privilege. When private relatives appear to inherit informal importance simply by being allowed through certain doors, critics gain a powerful weapon, and the institution begins to look less like a constitutional pillar and more like a private family arrangement. This created an entirely new dilemma for King Charles. The strategic interpretation of the situation revealed that, while the king viewed these gatherings as innocent family closeness, his closest constitutional advisors saw a glaring security and public relations liability. The timing changed everything when private secretaries formally compiled an internal brief detailing the increasing frequency of these informal visits. This wasn't a casual warning, it was an institutional intervention. The data presented to the king, made it clear that allowing this blurred boundary to continue would directly undermine the public credibility of his slimmed-down monarchy. The problem for the monarchy was that Charles had spent years balancing his deep personal affection for Camilla's children with his rigid duty to the crown. However, the evidence suggested that his patience had finally met a hard institutional wall. The institution reached a turning point where the risk of doing nothing and allowing these boundaries to erode further posed a far greater threat to his legacy than a painful domestic confrontation. The palace machinery, built on centuries of absolute discipline, demanded that a definitive line be drawn in royal stone to protect the sacred spaces of the sovereign crown from outside pressure. Looking back, what appeared to be an isolated family disagreement was actually a calculated institutional correction. The palace understood that the modern public no longer accepts mystery without suspicion, and every guest list must be guarded with ruthless precision. Charles was forced to realize that the comfort of his blended family could no longer coexist with the unyielding demands of his sovereign office, setting the stage for a dramatic shift in power. But what happened in the immediate aftermath of that realization changed everything. The timing was no coincidence. Armed with the damning internal brief from his private secretaries, King Charles initiated a highly pressurized, closed-door confrontation with Queen Camilla that would permanently reshape their marriage. What made this encounter important was the complete absence of typical royal diplomacy. It was a clinical, institutional intervention staged within the king's private study. The real issue was no longer about casual family invitations. Charles presented Camilla with a definitive ultimatum, demanding the immediate and absolute enforcement of strict boundaries regarding her family's access to royal properties, specifically targeting Tom Parker Bowles. This move fundamentally altered the power dynamic between the sovereign and his consort. The significance became clear when Charles made it understood that this was not a debate open for negotiation, but a direct sovereign directive. Looking back, his hidden motivation was not a sudden burst of malice toward his stepson, but a calculated defense mechanism against looming external threats. The king had been forced to recognize that the modern public watches the crown with absolute scrutiny, and allowing private relatives to appear adjacent to royal privilege was a vulnerability that could trigger a catastrophic public relations crisis. For Camilla, the confrontation was psychologically brutal, forcing her to realize that when the survival of the monarchy is at stake, the king will always choose the institution over his wife's feelings. The larger implication for the monarchy was a severe test of internal stability. This wasn't simply a domestic argument. It was a high-stakes, constitutional friction point between the emotional reality of a modern, blended family and the ancient, unyielding demands of the crown. By demanding that Camilla actively enforce the exile of her own son, Charles was testing her institutional absolute loyalty. The dilemma for the queen was agonizing. Resisting the order would position her as a threat to the king's authority, while compliance meant accepting a profound personal humiliation that severed her family from the symbolic heart of her royal life. What nobody realized at the time was how rigidly the palace infrastructure was prepared to back the king's play. The problem for the monarchy was that the blurred lines of the past could no longer be tolerated in a slimmed-down, highly scrutinized reign. Charles made it explicitly clear that the sanctity of royal spaces like Sandringham belonged exclusively to the state and those who serve it, not to private bloodlines. The confrontation stripped away the comfortable ambiguity that had protected their domestic life for nearly 2 decades, exposing the cold, crystalline reality that inside the House of Windsor, human affection is a luxury that must always bow to institutional survival. The evidence suggested that the king had crossed a personal Rubicon during those tense, quiet hours. He had deliberately chosen to inflict deep personal pain within his own household rather than risk a single fracture in the armor of the crown. The conversation ended without compromise, leaving an unresolved, icy tension that vibrated through the private quarters, altering the court's atmosphere completely. But before the queen could formulate a response, the institutional machinery had already taken the decision out of their hands. The timing of the confrontation carried enormous consequences, as it allowed the professional apparatus of the monarchy to step in and permanently codify the king's verbal directive. Private secretaries, senior courtiers, and formal royal advisors officially intervened, moving the dispute away from personal emotion and straight into the realm of state protocol. What made this intervention important was that it officially removed the decision from the king and queen's private jurisdiction. The real issue was no longer a marriage under strain. It was the rapid, bureaucratic execution of institutional defense. Legal and security teams immediately updated palace security databases, formally revoking Tom Parker Bowles' automatic clearance for the Sandringham Estate and transitioning the ban into an unyielding matter of official policy. This move fundamentally altered the landscape of succession management within the court. The larger implication became clear as the long shadow of Prince William and the future of the crown began to steer the narrative. Looking back, palace insiders would later realize that the younger generation of royals viewed these porous family boundaries with a sharper, entirely less sentimental eye. To the Prince of Wales, the modern survival of the monarchy required absolute discipline, structural clarity, and the total elimination of ambiguous privileges for non-working, adjacent relatives. The institution had reached a turning point where William's vision for a strictly guarded, tightly controlled crown completely overrode the current king's desire for domestic peace, leaving Camilla completely outmaneuvered by the permanent machinery of the state. The problem for the monarchy was that this structural hardening exposed a deep generational contrast in how power is protected. While Charles had spent his life navigating crises through private compromises and emotional concessions, the modern court operated with the brutal speed of digital age risk management. The palace understood that a single blurred line could be weaponized by critics into an existential scandal regarding nepotism and entitlement. By codifying the Sandringham ban, the institutional advisors successfully erected a defensive wall around the sovereign crown, prioritizing long-term survival over short-term domestic comfort. Every formal document signed and every security log updated served as a clinical reminder that inside the House of Windsor, the corporate firm will always weaponize its bureaucracy to crush personal vulnerabilities before they can mutate into public liabilities. What nobody realized at the time was how totally this institutional response paralyzed Queen Camilla's ability to mount a defense. She was no longer negotiating with her husband in a private study. She was facing a synchronized wall of institutional policy managed by the highest-ranking civil servants in the realm. The evidence suggested that her personal office was completely isolated, forced to receive written directives regarding security changes without any opportunity for appeal or modification. The strategic interpretation of this moment revealed that the crown was actively preparing for its future order, a leaner, colder, and more disciplined institution that would tolerate zero ambiguity from private bloodlines. The administrative cage had successfully locked into place, transforming an internal family grievance into an unchangeable reality of statecraft. With the institutional response finalized, the invisible policy rapidly shifted into highly visible consequences. The decision carried enormous consequences as the invisible bureaucratic directives rapidly manifested into concrete reality across the royal network. What made this important was the clinical, physical execution of the new boundaries within the palace infrastructure. This wasn't an ambiguous, unspoken understanding. It was a visible administrative purge. Palace insiders watched as the Sandringham guest manifests for the upcoming season were officially re-edited, and security clear passes for Tom Parker Bowles were physically deactivated. The timing changed everything when the king's private secretaries issued an updated protocol to the estate's security details at the main gates. The physical reality of the restriction immediately intensified the domestic freeze, making it impossible for staff to ignore the sudden shift in internal power. This development fundamentally altered the atmosphere within the court, revealing a deep transformation in how proximity to power was regulated. The real issue wasn't a routine scheduling conflict, it was a public declaration of a line drawn in royal stone. Every altered ledger and every revoked security badge served as an undeniable message to the household that the Queen Consort's family had been pushed back from the inner sanctum. For Camilla, watching these systemic changes unfold was deeply humiliating. Her hidden motivation had always been to quietly integrate her children into the fabric of the king's private life, to secure their long-term social standing. By making these changes permanent and visible to the entire palace staff, the institution effectively neutralized her efforts and reasserted the absolute dominance of the direct bloodline. The larger implication for the monarchy was a deliberate strategic warning sent to all non-working and adjacent relatives. The palace understood that the modern public watches the House of Windsor with an unprecedented level of scrutiny regarding privilege and taxpayer-funded assets. By visibly locking out the Queen's son from a primary royal stronghold, the Crown provided a clear, clinical example of its commitment to a slimmed-down, strictly disciplined institution. This move sent a shockwave through other factions of the extended family, proving that under the current regime, personal favor could be instantly sacrificed to manage institutional risk. The corporate machinery of the firm was demonstrating that it would tolerate zero ambiguity, prioritizing public perception and institutional armor over private family sentiments. What nobody realized at the time was how rapidly this internal realignment would accelerate. The problem for the monarchy was that the visible execution of the ban stripped away the final layers of privacy that had protected the family's internal struggles. Staff who normally managed the day-to-day logistics between the king and queen's respective offices were forced to operate with extreme caution, navigating a minefield of rigid procedures and icy interactions. The strategic interpretation of this phase made it clear that the palace was no longer willing to soften conflicts with polite compromises. It was enforcing strict compliance through cold administrative permanence. The institutional walls had been built, and the visible consequences left the key players with no choice but to accept the new order. The evidence suggested that the administrative trap had closed completely, leaving no room for negotiation or reversal. The comfortable ambiguity of the past was entirely gone, replaced by a highly regulated, rigid environment that prioritized the security of the crown above all else. The bureaucratic walls had been built, leaving the key players to face a brutal personal reckoning. The timing of these structural changes left no room for ambiguity, forcing King Charles and Queen Camilla into a final, low-intensity private meeting where the permanent enforcement of the ban had to be accepted. What made this specific interaction important was the total absence of explosive anger. It was a quiet, crushing realization that the administrative machinery had completely overridden their domestic life. The real issue was no longer about reversing the decision, but about navigating the wreckage of a severely fractured partnership. The significance became clear when Camilla, recognizing the unified wall of institutional policy backed by Prince William's faction, chose to yield rather than risk her own hard-won standing within the firm. That decision revealed a harsh truth about the absolute supremacy of the crown over personal marital bonds. Looking back, Camilla's strategic motivation for compliance was survival. She understood that continuing to fight a losing battle for her son's access would only position her as an adversary to the institutional armor Charles was desperately trying to build. For the king, the reckoning carried its own quiet torment. He had not backed down, proving that his hidden motivation was a calculated, defensive preservation of the monarchy's public legitimacy. However, the move fundamentally altered the atmosphere of their private quarters, replacing their once seamless emotional alliance with a cold, professional truce that vibrated with unresolved tension. The larger implication for the monarchy was a profound demonstration of internal discipline. This wasn't simply a domestic compromise. It was evidence that the House of Windsor survives precisely because it forces personal affection to bow before constitutional responsibility. The problem for the monarchy was that this personal victory for the institution left the sovereign household deeply hollowed out. While the defensive walls around Sandringham had been successfully fortified against the perception of informal family influence, the price paid was the permanent alienation of the queen consort's bloodline. The palace machinery had achieved its objective of structural clarity, but it had done so by extracting a devastating psychological toll from the sovereign himself. What nobody realized at the time was how heavily this quiet capitulation would weigh on the daily choreography of the court. The strategic interpretation of this phase revealed that while the king and queen continued to share the physical spaces of majesty, their operational alignment had been severed. Aides noted that the couple no longer lingered to discuss private matters after official briefings, choosing instead to retreat into their respective spheres of isolated authority. The evidence suggested that Charles had crossed a personal Rubicon, proving he was entirely willing to break the hearts of his inner circle to protect the legacy of his reign. The internal dispute was functionally settled, but the cold finality of their agreement created a volatile emotional vacuum that the palace could not contain indefinitely. The palace thought they had contained the fire behind closed doors, successfully locking down the details of the confrontation through strict communication embargoes. But in the modern media landscape, an internal realigning of this magnitude leaves too many visible scars to remain entirely hidden, setting the stage for an inevitable external breach. The internal dispute was settled, but the palace could not prevent the story from leaking into the public domain. The real conflict was only beginning as the invisible internal scars of the palace finally breached the walls of secrecy, leaking directly into the global media landscape. The timing of the leak carried enormous consequences, detonating a highly synchronized media storm just as the royal family was preparing for its high-profile winter schedule. What made this important was not the initial tabloid speculation, but the speed with which mainstream global outlets validated the rift. Within hours, the narrative of the Sandringham ban transformed from a whispered palace rumor into a dominant national conversation. The real issue shifted instantly from a private family grievance to a high-stakes debate over transparency, inherited privilege, and the modern boundaries of the sovereign crown. This development created an entirely new dilemma for the monarchy's communications apparatus. The significance became clear when the palace issued its standard, rigid refusal to comment, a move that insiders immediately interpreted as a tactical admission of guilt. In royal public relations, a swift and aggressive denial is weaponized to kill false rumors. A prolonged, heavy silence only confirms them. The problem for the monarchy was that this deliberate silence left a massive information vacuum that media commentators, constitutional experts, and anti-monarchy groups rushed to fill. Looking back, the strategic interpretation of the crisis revealed that the crown was entirely willing to absorb intense, short-term public relations hostility to protect the long-term, unyielding permanence of the institutional decision. The larger implication for the crown was a rapid polarization of public opinion regarding the king's authority and the queen's standing. Television networks and digital platforms were flooded with competing analyses dissecting the psychological motives behind the ban. Supporters of the direct bloodline praised King Charles for his ruthless protection of a lean, disciplined monarchy, viewing the ban as a necessary defense against the dangerous perception of informal family influence. Conversely, critics weaponized the leak to portray the House of Windsor as cold, dysfunctional, and fundamentally incapable of operating like a modern family unit. The controversy exposed the absolute vulnerability of a blended royal household, living under the uncompromising lens of modern public scrutiny, turning Camilla's private heartbreak into evidence of institutional volatility. What nobody realized at the time was how severely this public explosion paralyzed Queen Camilla's ability to manage her public image. The timing was catastrophic. Every scheduled appearance, every charitable engagement, and every official interaction was suddenly analyzed for hidden signs of distress or defiance. Her personal office was forced onto a permanent defensive footing, realizing that any attempt to soften the narrative or defend her son would be interpreted by the press as an open act of rebellion against the king's sovereign authority. The evidence suggested that the palace machinery was intentionally letting the public storm rage around the queen consort, using the external media pressure as a secondary ring of containment to ensure she maintained total compliance with the new institutional order. The public debate had intensified to a dangerous threshold, threatening to overshadow the constitutional weight of the upcoming royal season. The palace understood that words were no longer sufficient to stabilize the narrative or project an image of steady, unbroken governance. To regain control of the fracturing story, the monarchy had to retreat from the realm of press statements and prepare its most ancient and reliable weapon of mass distraction: undeniable visual symbolism. As the public debate intensified, the monarchy prepared its most powerful weapon, visual symbolism. What appeared to be a unified front was actually a masterclass in strategic risk management. As the public debate reached a dangerous threshold, the monarchy bypassed the traditional press office entirely, executing a highly coordinated public appearance that weaponized ancient visual choreography to suppress the narrative of internal collapse. The timing changed everything when King Charles and Queen Camilla stepped out together for the annual royal gathering, knowing that hundreds of high-definition lenses would dissect their every move. What made this moment important was that visual symbolism replaced dialogue entirely. The palace understood that the public would interpret their physical spacing and body language far more deeply than any official statement. The real issue wasn't whether the couple could simulate romantic harmony, but whether they could project absolute, disciplined adherence to institutional duty. Looking back, the strategic interpretation of their calculated distance revealed that while they remained flawlessly synchronized in their official movements, the emotional scar left by the Sandringham dispute remained completely unhealed. There were no spontaneous touches, no shared private glances, and no deviation from the rigid walking order dictated by centuries of court protocol. This move fundamentally altered the public conversation, shifting the focus away from tabloid speculation about a broken marriage and forcing observers to recognize the absolute, unyielding dominance of the direct bloodline over private grievances. The larger implication for the crown was a profound demonstration of operational continuity. By forcing Charles and Camilla to perform their public roles with absolute crystalline precision, the institutional machinery proved to the world that the operational stability of the British monarchy remains entirely unbroken by internal trauma. The problem for the monarchy was that this flawless performance extracted an immense psychological cost from both individuals. Charles appeared visibly exhausted, bearing the crushing weight of a sovereign who had sacrificed his domestic peace for the defense of his office, while Camilla carried herself with a rigid, protective restraint that signaled total, tragic compliance with the new boundaries. What nobody realized at the time was how effectively this symbolic appearance shifted the balance of power back to the courtiers. The evidence suggested that Prince Wales's faction viewed the flawless execution of this event as a definitive victory for their long-term legacy planning. By demonstrating that the king and queen would always choose the armor of the crown over personal sentimentality, the palace successfully neutralized the media storm, transforming a highly volatile family crisis into an undeniable display of institutional strength. The visual narrative had been successfully re-established, signaling to the world that the gates of the monarchy remained firmly closed to outside influence, leaving the underlying personal fracture to be permanently buried beneath the weight of majesty. The public performance had achieved its immediate objective, successfully stabilizing the crown's image in the eyes of a global audience. Yet, as the cameras were packed away and the royal motorcade departed, the analytical reality of the aftermath told a very different story, revealing a landscape where everything had changed behind the polished surface of the institution. The public performance was flawless, but the analytical reality of the aftermath told a very different story. The timing of the public performance left no room for doubt. The crisis had passed its acute phase, leaving behind a permanently altered power structure within the walls of the palace. What made this conclusion important was that the rules of access around the sovereign had been irrevocably rewritten. This wasn't a temporary compromise. It was an absolute, enduring administrative reality. From that moment forward, the boundary separating the active bloodline from adjacent relatives stood firmer than it had in generations. The significance became clear when looking at the strategic landscape. Prince William and his faction emerged as the definitive victors of this internal conflict, successfully securing an unyielding precedent of absolute discipline before his own future reign even begins. This development fundamentally altered the long-term legacy planning of the firm, revealing a cold truth about the ultimate cost of modern royal survival. The real issue was never simply about Tom Parker Bowles or a single winter guest list. It was about defining the modern limits of royal privilege. For Queen Camilla, the aftermath was a period of profound, quiet reflection. Her strategic calculation to yield had preserved her title and her official standing beside the king, but it came at the cost of a permanent, personal sacrifice. She had learned the most brutal lesson the House of Windsor has to offer. Inside the monarchy, human love and family loyalty can never outrank constitutional duty. The larger implication for the crown was an undeniable hardening of its institutional armor. The palace understood that by choosing structural clarity over domestic peace, it had successfully fortified the monarchy against the dangerous public perception of nepotism and blurred boundaries. The problem for the monarchy was that this defensive victory left the inner sanctum of the sovereign deeply hollowed out. The evidence suggested that while King Charles had successfully protected the integrity of his reign, the personal toll of enforcing such ruthlessness had left his household living under a permanent, quiet strain. The institutional machinery had achieved its objective of absolute compliance, proving that the corporate firm will always weaponize its bureaucracy to protect the continuity of the crown. Looking back, the strategic interpretation of the entire crisis reveals that the House of Windsor will always choose institutional survival over personal happiness. The palace machinery, built on centuries of unyielding discipline, operates with a cold administrative permanence that treats human emotion as a secondary concern. The structural alignment of the modern court had been secured, leaving a leaner, more disciplined, and entirely less sentimental institution prepared to face the future under the uncompromising lens of public scrutiny. The doors of Sandringham remain firmly closed, guarding a crown that survives only by breaking the hearts of the family forced to wear it,